Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. We begin tonight with a discussion of Sino-Indian standoff in eastern Ladakh. We discussed the standoff last Monday. Until then, our Indian guest, a former corps commander, was not prepared to accept that People's Liberation Army troops had moved west of China's claim line at multiple points, including in the Galwan Valley. Subsequent reports have laid to rest that position. PLA troops are indeed west of the CCL. That is precisely why there have been several rounds of talks between local commanders, at least 2 rounds at the level of major generals and the June 6th round at the lieutenant general level. There has also been a diplomatic round. The impasse continues. Let's dive right into the issue. For the military strategic side of the issue, we have with us Praveen Soni, a former Army officer and editor of Force magazine. Later, for some historical perspective, we will also speak with Iftikhar Gilani, an eminent Kashmiri journalist who has written about the '62 war and why that conflict happened. Let's go straight to Mr. Soni. Mr. Soni, you have a detailed cover story on the standoff in your magazine. So can we set aside the controversy about whether or not the PLA has salami sliced west of their claim line?
No, you see, this issue will remain for the simple reason that the line of actual control is still not very clear to both sides.
Correct.
For instance, it is a line which has not been agreed yet by either side. But yes, I agree with you to the extent that if the talks are happening at the political and diplomatic level, then something has gone wrong. But I would straight away not say that they have come in the line of actual control. Yes, something has happened. I would just leave it at that.
Okay, great. So there is the line of actual control, which is a line that neither side really accepts. There's India's claim line, there's China's claim line. That said, in your magazine cover story, you do mention 3 to 4 kilometers of ingress. But I'm happy that we have settled that. So what exactly is the ground situation with reference to PLA build-up, consolidation, and Indian Army's response?
So you see, these are all media reports. The reports are very clearly saying that 3 to 5 kilometers, at least at 3 places, which is Pangong So, which is Galwan Valley, and Demchok. So, and they are also referring to Nakula, which is in Sikkim, North
Correct.
Sikkim. So PLA has come in and they are saying that they are putting the strength to about 3,500 troops. They have come into the Indian perception of the line of actual control. Although, as you rightly pointed out, the Chinese position is that, look, we are talking of our claim line and this is our territory. So this is where the problem lies. But yes, the reports are very categoric that they have come in.
Okay. Your story, which is very comprehensive, also talks about Galwan, and it mentions that as opposed to, for instance, the Pangong So, the finger region, the so-called finger region, where there is the issue between who is going to patrol up to finger 8 and who is going to patrol up to finger 3 and the rest of it. But Galwan, your piece says, and it's generally also understood, it's also come out in other analyses, that the line was generally understood to be where it is supposed to be. Is that perception correct?
So let me put it like this, that insofar as Pangong So is concerned, it has no tactical importance.
Correct.
And which is one of the reasons why it is on the negotiating table. Both the sides are quite happy to discuss that.
Correct.
Now, as far as Galwan is concerned, it is very clear that this was not a disputed area. It has now become a disputed area. It's also very clear that they have come into our perception, India's perception of the line of actual control, and they are dominating the heights. So the reason is simple, that it overlooks a very important bridge. This is a bridge over the Sheok Valley, Sheok River, sorry. So this is an important bridge. Why it is important is because this is the bridge which will be used for the Indian Army reinforcements in case of a crisis in what is the subsector north, which is basically Siachen and Daulat Beg Oldie. So this is that entire region where India's infrastructure is still not developed much as compared to the PLA infrastructure. So it's an important road and an important bridge for us.
Okay, so this is the bridge that was inaugurated by the defense minister last year. It cuts the travel time to nearly half, and you don't have to ford through the river, especially when the river is angry, so to speak. But Ms. Sawhney, as I was reading your cover story, I was struck by something you wrote about the Doklam crisis. Now, here's a quote. Consequent to the ill-handled 2017 Doklam crisis by India, the PLA had in its Western Theatre Command tasked for the 3,488-kilometer line of actual control since winter of 1718, located at least 2 group armies, 3 Air Force bases, and 1 rocket force base. Now, I want to ask 2 questions with reference to this quote. One, all Indian commentary that I've read or watched recently since this standoff started talks about India's upper hand in Doklam. You don't seem to agree with that. That's my understanding. 2, given the force strength of PLA, do you think it is in response to India's raising in Jan 2014 of its 17 Mountain Strike Corps configured against China?
See, my assessment is that tactically India is very well placed at Doklam. We are holding the heights there, all the heights which overlook the Chumbi Valley, which is with the PLA, China. Now the issue is, we Indians have to ask ourselves that why is it that the PLA came and they started a problem at a place which is of complete disadvantage to them. So we have to look at a bigger picture, that there has to be something more. And that something more now comes out very clear, that after India declared a tactical victory, which was a foregone conclusion, then what was happening is, during the crisis, the Indian side was also building up troops and the PLA was also building up troops. So there was a reason to build up the troops. Whereas we came back, they never came back. And for that, the 2 of us, India and China, we have a 1993 agreement which clearly says that each side will consult one another before more troops are inducted. So they were able to negate that clause of the 1993, the PLA, by creating this crisis. And then they had a valid excuse that, look, we also built up because the Indian side was building up. And today, while we have come back, they have strengthened that further. They have built a habitat there, they've built a ecosystem there, and they have got something like 200,000 troops there. So when you see that big picture, in the big picture, it becomes very clear that we did not assess, Indian side did not see the operational and the strategic reasons for the PLA to do Doklam.
Okay, so the PLA has been, as you said, they've built a habitat, there's an ecosystem, they've been conducting realistic combat training. Now, given the increased, what you say, forces in being threat, the Indian Army should be prepared for more similar surprises. I mean, this is again a quote from what you wrote. Does that put pressure on India? Now, the reason I ask is that the response would be for India to develop similar infrastructure. But the development of that infrastructure is precisely one of the reasons, not all the reason, but one of the reasons what's happening now. So it becomes a kind of untenable situation for India both ways. Would you agree?
Yeah, so you see, what has happened is that the pressure, what I call the military coercion, because of the forces in being, that has shot up. So this will remain a very big challenge for the Indian Army. In fact, there are reports today in our media which clearly says that more and more army is being inducted in. So basically, the induction is not for fighting, the induction is for policing duties, which is not a very good thing for any professional army, yes, because they are sitting now on their own territory. They are already acclimatized at altitude of 16,000 feet. They've got their entire, as I said, the ecosystem there. They are doing training there. In the case of India, the troops have to acclimatize. It's a long acclimatization lasting 21 days to be operating at those heights. And besides that, the job really is policing job. So to that extent, Doklam, I mean, somebody should have thought about it, that look, the PLA can't be fools. that they are coming and doing a crisis at a place where we have an advantage, India has an advantage. But obviously, few people saw that at that time.
Okay.
In fact, few people are even acknowledging today.
That's correct. But very quickly, since I'm running out of time also, let's talk about China's broader strategic objectives. Now, I'm assuming that these tactical and theater moves must plug into something bigger. Now, inevitably, if that is correct, that question must also draw us into a discussion of what are India's and Indian Army's options.
So you see, as far as the Chinese are concerned, I am very clear that they are looking for a unipolar Asia. That is one. And I am also very clear that the Chinese, when you see the Western Pacific and you see the Indian Ocean region, like ASEAN is the pivot for the Western Pacific, India is the pivot for the Indian Ocean region, and the Chinese are already coming in. The Belt and Road Initiative has come in South Asia. So they are seeking cooperation, but cooperation from a position of strength. Because at the end of the day, they see themselves only pitted against America. At the end of the day, it's about their strategy, which is Asia-Pacific strategy pitted against Indo-Pacific strategy.
Correct.
That is where the big game goes on. So they are seeking cooperation, that is their game. Now, insofar as India is concerned, you see, I do not see any military options. In fact, I've been saying this for the last 10 years, and why I don't see any military option is that PLA has already gone so much ahead. In fact, I keep talking here that look, we are talking of a different war. As far as India and Pakistan are concerned, we are looking at a hybrid war, which is way below to what they are looking at. Today, they are preparing for what is called the algorithm war.
Correct.
You see, and which is what has got the Americans worried. So the point is, we honestly don't have many military options. So this should be a wake-up call for us. For two things, wake-up call to make peace with Pakistan. We have to quieten one of the military lines that we have. Otherwise, there is no rise for India. I am very clear on that. And the way is to make peace with Pakistan and cooperation with China.
Mr. Sawhney, that doesn't seem to be on the agenda of this government. But very quickly, since you've talked about the algorithm war, I mean, the point is that now this is going to be the battlefield, is going to be the new technologies, multiple new technologies. This is a completely different kind of environment. Now, India has risen up to be the third largest spender on defense, according to SIPRI, short of just China. So there's United States, then China, then India. But India seems to not really understand that if it has to spend so much money, then it's got to be a tech-intensive military rather than a labor-intensive military. Would you agree with me?
I would like to put it like this, that first of all, India has had too much of focus on Pakistan. So it's always been about hybrid war, and that is what we've been looking at. Now, insofar as China is concerned, even today, if we understand the right war, if we understand what is the war that the adversary is preparing for, an adversary which is refusing to have a border resolution, then we can look at asymmetrical capabilities. How is it? I mean, this is the same narrative that the PLA did against the US Army. You see, once they realized what the US Army could do, they build up an asymmetric narrative. The similar narrative can be built here, but for that, it's not about budgets. It's about identifying the right adversary and identifying the right war. That is, I think, what is missing.
But it seems to me that if this thing gets resolved, the PLA is not going back as far as the Galwan sector is concerned. Would you agree with me?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is absolutely clear. Now, whether they are in our territory or not, that's another matter. The point is they build up the permanent defenses. They are absolutely clear that what they have dug in for a particular purpose, it will not be dismantled, so they're not going anywhere. And in any case, Galwan Valley is not on the table for talks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Praveen Sawhney speaking with us. We now go to Iftikhar Gilani. Mr. Gilani, you have written about the Henderson Brooks Bhagat report. Tell us what that report was about and why India hasn't made it public.
First of all, thank you that you had the most informed panelist, Mr. Parveen Sahani, who gave a very perspective of what is happening. This actually is not a line control which is delineated. This line of actual control has not been delineated. And over the years now, I think the issue which actually you are discussing here, they started happening right from 2013, Deep Sang, then 2014 Timor, and 2000 then Doklam, and so on and so on. Actually, China, right from 2013, is creating new actual ground position lines on this line. Now, referring to this Henderson Brooks report, which you are mentioning, some of the portions were leaked or released by an Australian journalist in Maxwell, but most of his portion has not been released even after 58 years. It was actually the General Henderson and Brigadier Bhagat. This committee was set up by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru soon after the 1962 India-China war. And this report was supposed to actually look after what actually led to the war, and actually to probe actually the role of the political and the military leadership. While the role of the political and military leadership has come out and has been leaked and has been released somehow, not officially but unofficially, but the most important aspect of this report is that which exactly is about the delineation of the border, about the maps. When this Kuldeep Nair, this very late journalist, had raised the element also for the release of this report, he went on the report. He went on the Chief Information Commission to using the Right to Information Act. This case went on and on and on and on, and then reached to the Chief Information Commissioner, because Wajat Habibullah, who was actually Chief Information Commissioner. And he, after some hearings, he also rejected his petition and said that this report cannot be made public. But
he also said this to you. If I remember, Wajat Habibullah also said this to you.
Yes, he has actually mentioned it also at many times, that there is a wide disparity between the maps submitted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the maps which were submitted by the Defense Ministry. Once, if this report comes out and officially, and the government of India owns it up, then India-China border dispute is over. Then this Defense Ministry maps, they are almost saying that having a different lines, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs maps is having a different lines, and it has a story behind also. The story behind is that in 1950, India's first Prime Minister Nehru, it is in this A.G. Noorani's book also, the history in the A.G. Noorani's book on the India-China border dispute, he has mentioned a 17-page memorandum was issued by Nehru to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and to the missions all over. And a night-long operation happened in the South Block, the headquarters of the India's Ministry of External Affairs, where all old maps were burned down. New maps
were created. New maps
were created.
And these were the maps that they presented to the Chinese.
It is actually yes, exactly. It is actually they flirting with the maps which has created this problem.
And India is again flirting with the maps, by the way. It's flirting with the maps, this time towards Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan.
Exactly. This urge for not flirting with the maps continues. But at that time, now this flirting of maps has created a bigger issue, bigger problems. I'll tell you just one next at the area of Jammu and Kashmir. The area of Jammu and Kashmir in 1891, the first census, it was mentioned 80,900 square miles. Correct. It was in 1911, British increased it to 84,258 miles. In 1947, on 22nd October 1947, when Kashmir, when this India and Pakistan came into existence, a white paper issued by the Ministry of Home Affairs of the Government of India, which was led by the Patel, it mentions the area of Jammu and Kashmir 82,258 square miles. And this continues. And in 1961, this area was increased to 86,024 square miles. Where from this territory came? Nobody in India is asking the government in 1961 how this territory was increased. So it was definitely with an eye on the India-China border dispute that this territory was increased.
So Henderson,
in a way, actually, it's.
Mr. Gilani, since I'm running short of time, This Henderson Bhagat report apparently also was very, critical of the performance of the Indian Army during the 65 war.
Exactly, but these issues, this Maxwell has mentioned it in his book Himalayan Blunder. But these issues of the boundaries, they have never come out. Yes, there are scathing comments on the Indian Army, the way they left the areas unattended.
Including Daulat Beg Oldie, where the Chinese never came.
Exactly, in Daulat Beg also, India's official history says that they had to retreat because Chinese had come to Daulat Beg Oldie. But those people who have been as supporters with the army at Daulat Beg Oldie, which was a battalion headquarters, they were saying quite categorically that no Chinese army had come to Daulat Beg Oldie. It was a battalion. It was led by the Major Randhawa and the colonels. They left on their own, and there was Chinese army had not reached to the Daulat Beg Oldie. And there are very scathing comments on this report on the performance of the Indian Army, and even the political leadership at that time, and even the defense minister at that time as well. But the larger issue is that this country, there are 14 countries bordering, and out of 14 the land boundaries, I mean, not the maritime boundaries. Out of those 14 countries, India is the only one which is not able to settle its border disputes with China. And the way this area, this Ladakh, it used to be at least a connecting link between Central Asia and South Asia. Just a century ago, this Turkic language used to be the second language in this area. It was a lingua franca. This area has now become isolated. This area has become just a periphery of the world.
Absolutely. I've run out of time, but thank you so much, Iftikhar Gilani, for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss India's introduction of new domicile laws in Indian occupied and now illegally. Welcome back to In Focus. We now discuss India's introduction of new domicile laws in Indian occupied and now illegally annexed Kashmir. We did a segment on that illegal move a couple of weeks ago, but given its importance and the sinister motives behind the move, it is imperative to present to our viewers a detailed review of what this move is about and how must the world respond to it. It is also instructive to note that while these laws contained in a notification could deprive genuine Kashmiris of the right to their own land, they open the gates for non-Kashmiris to settle in Kashmir and own property there. This is straight out of the Israeli playbook. But let's, without further ado, go to our expert here, Mirza Saib Beg. Mr. Beg is a Kashmir lawyer currently studying public policy at the University of Oxford. Mr. Beg, it's great to have you on the program. Let me tell you how I want to play this. You get the floor to explain the devil in the fine print of these laws, and then we'll take it up from there. Over to you, Mr. Beg.
Well, first of all, it was very rightly pointed out by you, but that this is a move in furtherance of the annexation that took place last year. And I want to remind people, your viewers, about how the Indian government's action of annexing Kashmir is quite reminiscent of Serbia's Slobodan Milosevic regime in 1989 that had unilaterally revoked Kosovo's autonomy and imposed direct rule from Belgrade on Kosovo's Albanian majority. The Indian government and the Indian people must be reminded that that move ultimately led to the breakup of Yugoslavia. Now, specifically on the domicile law notification that has been made right now, it allows Indian citizens to move to Kashmir. There are certain criteria that they have set out, but effectively it allows Indian citizens to buy land and secure jobs in Kashmir. So this is going to cause a demographic change. It's also going to cause an irreparable impact on our ecology, on our environment, because the unplanned influx of Indians into Kashmir is going to have an irreversible impact on our way of life. They have made certain categories of Indians who can move. Anyone who meets the criteria is allowed to move to Kashmir. The first is that of Indians who have lived in Kashmir for 15 years. The second is that of Indians who have studied in Kashmir for a period of 7 years. And the third is that of Indians whose parents have served in Kashmir for a period of 10 years with any undertaking of the government of India. There are also other categories for non-Muslim migrants who have been living in Kashmir. and for West Pakistan refugees who had moved to Kashmir in 1947. Now, all of this is quite interesting because it is effectively extinguished the right of Kashmiri Muslim migrants who moved to Pakistan in 1947, escaping the Jammu massacre violence. Their right of return has been extinguished. However, the right has been created for any Indian to move to Kashmir, even if those Indians have never lived in Kashmir. And there's a sense of urgency with which India is trying to legalize this new status. And that is reflected in the new domicile law notification, where these certificates have to be issued to any applicant within 15 days of application. What needs to be understood here is that the processing of these applications is going to be done by Kashmiris, the Tehsildar, the local officers. They're all mostly Kashmiris. And if any one of them were to refuse an application or delay an application beyond 15 days, that officer will be penalized 50,000 rupees from his or her salary for such a delay. Now, this law is a major departure from the established procedure under Article 35A of India's own constitution, under the 1952 Delhi Agreement, and even under Kashmir's own constitution under Section 6A. Now, Section 3A of the new law defines that it establishes who can move to Kashmir, and it includes children of central government employees. It includes all Indian service officers, officials of public sector undertakings, officials of autonomous bodies under the central government, public sector banks, officials of statutory bodies, officials of central universities, research institutes of the central government, all of those who have served in Jammu and Kashmir. And like I said, that there's a 1982 law which has now been repealed. That 1982 law allowed the residents of Kashmir who had escaped in 1947, it allowed them and their children to return to Kashmir. That has been extinguished. And at the same time, India has given this right to West Pakistan refugees who are not Kashmiris. These are mostly of Sikh origin who migrated. There are about 5,000 of these families who had migrated to Kashmir in 1947. And India has taken the stand that since these are refugees living in Kashmir for a long time, they should be given the right of domicile. However, it is quite ironic because a similar treatment has never been given to the Rohingya refugees who were seeking safe space in India. They were treated quite badly. And in fact, Kashmiris have even given the right of occupation for land to those West Pakistan refugees. However, this is not the way the Rohingya Muslims have been treated by India. And what is pertinent over here is that for a diasporic Kashmiri, the space to apply for residence now, to apply for a PRC, a permanent residence certificate, that is entirely extinguished because the rules are silent about the treatment for diasporic Kashmiris. If there is someone who is born to Kashmiri parents, who's living outside India, and they do not already have an existing PRC certificate, then there is no provision as of now in the rules for that person to apply for domicile. I'm expecting an amendment or a clarification on these rules in the next few days, but effectively, as of now, the child of an Indian citizen is eligible to move to Kashmir, even if that child has never lived in Kashmir. But the child of a diasporic Kashmiri may not be eligible if the parents do not possess an existing certificate of residence. Now, what is even more sinister in this is that if a Kashmiri fails to meet the new criteria, and here I'm talking about the already resident Kashmiris, because we are now expected to take our permanent residence certificates, go to our Tehsildar and obtain a domicile certificate.
Just a second, Mr. Beg, saying that the Kashmiris who are residents of Kashmir, who have been living there for generations, also need to go and get the PRC and get verified that they actually lived here?
Absolutely correct. So what is happening right now is that the domicile certificate has been made mandatory for certain jobs, and it has been made mandatory for employment and education in Kashmir. So if you want to get your children admitted in educational institutions, you need to have a domicile certificate. If you want to buy land in Kashmir, you need to have a domicile certificate. So effectively, and also it's important to point out that the state is the largest provider of employment in Kashmir because all avenues of private employment are defunct. We have hartals and curfews and internet shutdowns frequently. Sometimes the internet is shut for months on an end. So we don't have any scope for an e-commerce industry to flourish in Kashmir. So the state has become the repository of all employment, and these jobs are now open to anyone. even Indians, and of course to Kashmiris as well. But earlier they were reserved only for Kashmiris. So if you want to apply for these jobs, you need to have a domicile certificate. And this is, if you, now what I was trying to point out earlier was that if a Kashmiri now fails to meet the new criteria, whether that is done by malice or manipulation or by a design of the new rules, the revocation of their residency rights inevitably will mean that that Kashmiri has to leave Kashmir and go to India in search of jobs and shelter. This is a forcible transfer of population. It qualifies as a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, as well as a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So all in all, what this means is that the Kashmiri people are being disempowered. They are being the rights that we have earned for ourselves after decades of struggle against feudalism under the Maharaja, those rights are being taken away from us.
Okay, so if we were to accept this mythical instrument of accession, the fact is that what happened later disallows the exercise of Indian constitution on the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Am I correct in assuming that?
Under the instrument of accession, India only has access, if at all, the instrument of accession in itself is a very contested document.
Correct.
There is enough scholarship available questioning the legitimacy as well as the existence of that document.
Which is why I said the mythical.
Yes. Now, the power to define permanent residence in Kashmir, it is under Section 6 of Kashmir's own constitution. And it's important to remember that the constitution of Kashmir was never set up under an authority of the Indian constitution, nor was the Constituent Assembly of Kashmir set up by a sanction of the government of India. Correct. This was set up by the state of Jammu and Kashmir itself, acting independently under the Maharaja's proclamation. And I can give you the date of that proclamation as well. It's May the 1st, 1951. Now, the Indian Parliament lacks legislative competence to amend our constitution directly. It can only pass certain provisions of its own constitution to us through Article 370. Now, to make any changes in this structure, under the instrument of accession, India gets access only to communications, defense, and foreign policy, foreign affairs in Kashmir. So if you want to add anything new to it, it can only be done by when there's a ratification by the State Assembly. And if Article 370 itself had to be amended, that can only be done by the Constituent Assembly of Kashmir, which was dissolved in the 1950s. The
Constituent Assembly dissolved itself. So therefore,
yes,
this is. But here's another point, Mr. Beg. We talk about Narendra Modi, and of course, it's an abomination in the sense that it has a very Hindutva RSS agenda. But if one goes back, and I think one of the definitive works on this, 370, if we take, is A.G. Noorani's book. Successive Indian governments, the so-called liberal governments, the secular Congressite governments, hollowed out 370. So what has happened to Kashmir seems to me that instead of taking a snapshot view of it, we have to look at the longer trajectory to see how India collectively, politically, regardless of the ideology of that politics, has dealt with Kashmiris in a way which reminds one of how you deal with a colony.
Indeed. Yes, you're absolutely right. This has been a systemic dismantling of Kashmiri rights, and the domination and degradation of Kashmiris has always been cheered on by Indians. And this underscores the fact that Modi has not made India, but it's rather the other way around. It is India that has made Modi. Whether it is Nehru's India or Vajpayee's India, there's always been a slow-burning offensive against the Kashmiris. The only difference is that under Modi, this offensive has been funneled into a virulent anger, which is meant to strip us of our rights. So whether you look at Vajpayee or Modi or any Indian government or even under the Congress, they've always worked towards dismantling Article 370. In fact, as early as 1964, Gulzari Lal Nanda, he gave a speech on the floor of the parliament where he accused Nehru of having completely hollowed out Article 370. There was nothing left in it except this last bit which guaranteed our protection for our internal structure, land reforms. Just those things were left in Article 370 now. It gave us protection against Indian interference. But now even that has been removed. And it is important to point out that successive Indian governments have colluded with governments in Kashmir who have allowed this to take place. But we live in an occupational structure where it's not possible, it's extremely difficult for to oppose, to obstruct what is being done. And even now, since this domicile law has been passed, it's difficult to fight this from within Kashmir. It's important that the global community raises their voice and comes forward and opposes this. But the sinister nature of this move is highlighted in the fact that it was the law was passed while India, as well as most of the world, is dealing with the pandemic.
Correct.
So there's little possibility of protest. There's an economic and medical crisis right now. If you look at India, just the last few weeks, their priorities are especially pronounced right now because this change in domicile law is being made during an unprecedented economic and medical crisis, where you must have seen visuals of their migrant laborers who are walking to exhaustion. They're walking hundreds of kilometers, and many of them are dying of exhaustion. And at that time, India thought that this is a priority, that this domicile law amendment is a priority at this time. I would say that this is Indian apathy's new crowning hour of disgrace.
Absolutely, and the speed with which they want to process, like you said, 15 days, clearly shows what the agenda is. But very quickly, because I have to wrap up also, what is the way forward?
Well, it's difficult to say what the way forward would be from within Kashmir because there are lawyers groups who are trying to oppose this move by seeking a stay order. However, the courts have been fairly lax on acting against the government of India.
Correct.
So in response to what is being done to Kashmiris, we have realized that we can't indulge in despair or despondency, but we have to continue to engage in the persistent labor of resistance. Now, the impetus is right now on the international community. They have to understand that this is an utter violation. This is a reckless violation of rights of peoples and of democracy by the Indian state, and therefore concrete action needs to be taken by them. So there is an onus of responsibility on the international community to step up its response and understand that this is not just a violation that has taken place in a very small part of the world. This can have ramifications which are of a global nature.
Also, it is a compilation of UN resolutions and also bilateral arrangements. This is a disputed territory. This is an area that's been occupied. So the law of occupation, among other things, demands that the status and nature of the area and the people cannot be disturbed. But thank you so much, Mirza Saib Beg. It's a pleasure listening to you and explaining why the world should worry about this. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.